Good afternoon, everyone. And this afternoon, we're discussing two topics. That is microbial disease of the digestive system, and then somewhat briefly, the microbial diseases of the urinary tract. In actual fact, the microbial diseases of the digestive system are amongst the most important of the topics to discuss in clinical microbiology. And the reason for that is that diarrheal diseases, most of which are acquired through the oral fecal route, are still a major determinants of morbidity and mortality in the human population, together with the great respiratory disease, influenza, and tuberculosis. Diarrheal diseases of the gut are amongst the most important determinants of the human population size. Throughout our history, they have been extremely important. So I want to remind you that there is a section, several slides, which I'm not going to cover, about the anatomy of the digestive system, which you need to review, make sure that you understand the anatomy. And when you do so, keep in mind, I've just messed this up. There you are, sorry. Just bear in mind that one of the reasons for this huge importance of the gut as a source of infection is that it provides a passage to the interior of the body. The whole of the gut cavity is actually connected to the outside. And we take in food. Along with the food, we take in a huge amount of bacterial material during our lifespan. Very little of it is going to make its way past the stomach, which is an extremely acid environment. But there are those organisms which can, and which find their way into the gut cavity itself. And remembering that we have a huge microflora in the gut, a huge natural, normal microflora in the gut, which actually provides us with a huge amount of protection from pathogens. Nonetheless, pathogens can make their way into the interior. But there's one really important thing to note, that this, although we can certainly acquire serious disease just of the interior of the gut, that does not mean that there is access by pathogens to the real interior, to the sacred, sterile interior, the peritoneum, the thoracic cavity, this sort of thing. However, there are instances where bacteria make their way across the walls of the digestive system and do find their way into these cavities, and then very, very serious consequences can arise. So just distinguish in your minds the diseases that take place inside the gut cavity itself, and then diseases arising from the gut cavity which make their way into the interior spaces like the abdominal cavity or the thoracic cavity. Because of the dangers that are posed because this continual intake of bacteria, and also because the gut needs to maintain a normal gut flora, which itself could become pathogenic if it was to find its way into the peritoneum or something like that, into the peritoneal cavity rather. There is a huge investment in immune protection for the gut. All the way from the mouth to the anus, there is a rich investment of immunological tissues which protect us from infection through the gut wall. And in fact, about 70% of the immune system is located in the intestinal tract. It's an extraordinary thing, but it's a measure of how important it is that bacteria in the gut be carefully controlled. They're abundant, but they need to be carefully controlled. The two sets of immune tissue are the gut-associated lymphoid tissues, GALT, and the mucosal associated lymphoid tissues, or MALT. Throughout the gut, we find lymph vessels and lymph nodes draining the gut tissues. But there are also small patches of what are equivalent to lymph nodes, really. They're in that they are lymphatic tissues called the Peyer's patches. There are very specialized cells in the walls of the gut called microfold or M cells. And those M cells are part of the immune system, and they actually continually sample gut fluids. They're continually sampling what is passing through the gut. And if they encounter antigen, if they encounter pathogen, they communicate that to the gut-associated or mucosal-associated lymphoid tissues and spark an immune reaction. So you've actually got cells which are dedicated to sampling, to making sure that notice is kept of what is passing through the gut. Then, in addition, there are other cells. For example, there are these highly specialized cells called PANAF cells, which produce antimicrobial granules, which are released to the gut surface. And there are many, 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 many different kinds of macrophages, phagocytic cells, which patrol the gut walls and ensure that try to ensure that pathogens do not proliferate or make their way across the gut wall. So I've already mentioned the normal microflora of the gut. This is incredibly diverse. There are millions of bacteria per milliliter, even of saliva. And within the gut, within the small intestine especially, and then moving on into the large intestine, a huge population of many, many, many different species of bacteria. It's a mixture of anaerobes and facultative anaerobes, a few obligate aerobes, but you'll realize that by and large, to survive in the gut, an organism would need some anaerobic capability for the most part. And if you look at feces are mostly bacterial, and as it's food waste that hasn't been digested, but a lot of bacteria as well, and up to 100 billion per gram of feces. And that is reflective of the size of the populations, especially in the large intestine. But there is a substantial microflora in the small intestine as well. The one area of the gut which really has a very low microbial population, but it's not zero, is the stomach. And that is because of the low pH of the stomach, it's because it produces hydrochloric acid. Okay, so one of the commonest diseases of the digestive tract is in fact tooth decay. It is dental caries. In the mouth, we have a very, very rich microflora, and it's specialized to the mouth. Under normal circumstances, that microflora does no harm. In fact, it's strongly protective. This is a normal, healthy tooth. There's something to observe about this tooth, though. There are spaces. First of all, look here. There are crevices between the teeth and the gum. And in actual fact, there is a gap here between the gum and the tooth. Further down, it should be cemented with connective tissues, sealed with connective tissues. But up here, there's actually space. Then the tooth itself is a surface. And you know by now that bacteria love surfaces. And yes, it is true that the teeth normally are covered with a microflora, a normal natural microflora. If that microflora remains undisturbed, it is protective because it crowds out any likely pathogens. But unfortunately, we tend to mess with the microflora of our mouths. And the major way in which we do so is by diet, and especially by increasing the amount of carbohydrate that we provide to the microflora, which is not normal. It is not a natural situation. But we, as humans, we have a tendency to love sugar, to love small carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates like the sugars. And this is one of the most important influences on the structure of the mouth microflora. And for example, one of the important bacteria which is favored by a high sugar diet is this one, Streptococcus mutans. And Streptococcus mutans responds to the presence of sugar by converting it to lactic acid. And not only that, but Streptococcus mutans produces a substance, a polysaccharide called dextran, which is a tough polysaccharide which binds bacteria to the tooth. And this is what forms dental plaque. That plaque in itself acts as a further surface for other bacteria. And Streptococcus mutans is by no means the only bacterium which can cause dental decay, but it is one of the most important. So what happens now is we begin to set up an alternative community to the normal bacterial community. Now we're favoring those bacteria which can actually produce acids and which can end up digesting away the tooth enamel. Here is Streptococcus mutans, typical Streptococcus. It's in chains like this. You can see here, even in culture, it lays down dextran as an extracellular material that binds it to the surface and also probably provides it with protection from immune attack and everything. Tooth decay proceeds in different stages. First of all, remember, enamel is extremely hard, very, very, very hard. So it's very resistant to mechanical abrasion, but very susceptible to chemical degradation and production of these bacterial acids begins to break down the enamel. If the enamel decays enough, the cavity reaches the soft tissues of the interior of the tooth. And once that happens, the decay begins to spread very rapidly through the interior of the tooth, resulting ultimately in the loss of the tooth. Now, this is strictly tooth decay. Take note. The accompanying that tooth decay very often is gum disease as well, because the bacteria are able to colonize close to the gums or in those spaces close to the gums or else between the gum and the tooth, and they set up an inflammatory condition. The immune system begins to respond to that very powerfully, and we begin to get an inflammation of the gums, which actually exacerbates the infectious conditions. When it's simply the gums itself, this is referred to as gingivitis. It's inflammation of the gums, and we often notice this, the beginnings of gingivitis, because these gums, the gums that have gingivitis, are very prone to bleeding. And you notice when you brush your teeth that you're producing blood. You've almost certainly got gingivitis somewhere. There are many, many different bacteria that will contribute to gingivitis: Streptococcus, actinomyces, various other gram-negative bacteria, and many anaerobes. And as gingivitis proceeds, one of the symptoms of gingivitis is actually bad breath, because many of these bacteria start to produce sulfurous compounds as they break down gum proteins and things like that, as they digest food trapped in these spaces. They begin to produce sulfurous compounds which smell really foul. Gingivitis can proceed to another condition called periodontitis, And this is when, in actual fact, let me come back here. This is when the gingivitis would be inflammation of this area here. Periodontitis is when this spreads and it begins to attack the periodontal ligaments and the connective tissue, actually sealing the tooth. And it begins to move down and around the tooth. This is an extremely dangerous situation in terms of tooth decay, because it can loosen the teeth, and teeth can actually very soon be lost. It can, in fact, even attack the bone, begin to attack the bone of the socket, of the tooth socket. There are some specific bacteria associated with this. Phyromonas is one of them, but there are many others as well. Now, in extreme cases, a condition called acute necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis can produce a rampant decay of the gum tissues. This is if you are infected with this bacterium called Prevotella intermedia. And this is seldom seen these days because people would usually long since have sought dental care, and especially because it's so incredibly foul smelling that anybody around them will soon dispatch them to a dentist. But this is something that you see, for example, amongst impoverished populations and in the homeless, for example, who have not had sought dental, who are not able to easily seek dental care. But nowadays, this is not a common consequence. But gingivitis and periodontitis they are very common. So periodontal disease can result in the recession of gum, and it will cause the recession of gum all the way down the tooth, exposing weak areas of enamel all the way down, which then are subject to further decay. This is the commonest cause of tooth loss from the mouth, is periodontal disease like this. Okay, so remember, although I've done it quickly, dental disease, the commonest disease of the digestive tract, if we are simply looking at how often, at frequency of occurrence. If somebody was judged to have any kind of disease of the digestive tract, dental disease would be right up there as the primary type. But there are many, many others. As we go through this, notice how very frequently disease of the gut is associated with fecal contamination of food, fecal contamination of water, or direct transfer of fecal matter by people not washing their hands, this sort of thing. These are very common routes to acquire pathogenic bacteria in the inside of the gut. So here's a very common one. And this is the classic food poisoning, which arises from Staphylococcus. And it's Staphylococcus aureus, the same Staphylococcus that most of us have present on our skin, for example, but the same Staphylococcus that causes boils of the skin, pimples, all sorts of lesions can be caused by Staphylococcus aureus, and often people are quite unaware of the fact that they have it. People may have a small infected cut on their finger, for example, or around the bed, along the side of the bed of a nail, something like this, and don't even really realize that they are culturing Staph aureus. They then go and prepare food, and when they prepare the food, they infect the food with Staph aureus. If that food is then left at even a cool temperature, not necessarily refrigerated, but doesn't have to be warm, the Staph aureus will grow and they are very resistant to things like high osmotic pressure. Even if there's a lot of salt or whatever, they'll grow quite happily. Remember that they're adapted to really difficult conditions on our skin, which has a high salt content. As they do so, as they grow in the food, they release an exotoxin, and it is called an enterotoxin. Enterotoxin means it affects the gut. Specifically, it affects the gut, but it is an exotoxin. It is released from the growing cells. This is your classic church picnic potato salad that Aunt Sally has made. And Aunt Sally had a little cut on her finger that was infected, and it didn't really bother her, but she prepared the potato salad, and the potato salad was then left out on the table for a couple of hours before the lunch started. And then everybody eats the potato salad, and within an hour or so, they are throwing up violently and they have violent diarrhea. This is the classic kind of rapid food poisoning, rapid onset food poisoning. And it's rapid onset because people are responding to an intoxication. They have actually, there's a toxin there that is producing, not an infection. The Staph aureus itself is not going to survive beyond the stomach, but the toxins certainly do. So that's Staphylococcus aureus, enterotoxin poisoning. Here's another one though. This is Shigella, caused by the organism Shigella, and it is called shigellosis. And shigellosis is also called bacillary dysentery. And this is a much more dangerous situation. The Staph aureus is usually self-limiting and it's nasty, but it's soon over. Shigellosis is caused by this gram-negative bacterium, which is also able to produce an enterotoxin. It's a very powerful toxin called a Shiga toxin. And what it does is it actually causes, changes to the structure of cells of the gut wall. And the Shiga toxins are so powerful that they actually can produce effects on the kidneys as well. This is produced, the toxins circulate, and they cause breakdown, for example, of blood corpuscles and things, puts enormous strain on the kidneys, and it ends up causing a uremia, an actual infection and inflammation of kidneys, which can be extremely dangerous. They cause tremendous damage. A Shigella infection causes damage to the gut wall, and this produces a bloody stool, and that is the dysentery part. Dysentery refers to this watery, bloody stool that is produced as a result of some bacterial infections. The problem with Shigella is it survives passage through the stomach very well. And not only that, it attaches specifically to M cells. Remember, those are part of the immune system, and it actually attaches to them. It gains entrance. They attach, they gain entrance to the M cell, and they begin to reproduce in the M cell. And then they spread from the M cells, they spread to adjacent cells and then out from adjacent cells. And they can actually end up producing an abscess condition on the gut wall. And they can actually end up, they can, in exceptional cases, end up being spread through the bloodstream. But this is not the major risk. The major risk is this infection of the gut wall itself, which is tremendously damaging and produces this violent bloody diarrhea. Okay, so that's Shigella, but remember the Shiga toxin, because Shiga toxin is actually produced by some other bacteria as well, but remember its effects. So here's the gut infection that you've probably heard most about, and that is Salmonellosis. caused by Salmonella, and you'll hear that people that have suffered from Salmonella food poisoning. It's a Salmonella gastroenteritis. Salmonella is a very diverse group. Here they're given a species name, Salmonella enterica. It's a normal part of the gut flora, but it's kept in check by competition from other bacteria. So in order to produce this disease effect, it's actually usually ingestion of one of many, many different pathogenic forms of Salmonella. There are more than 2,000 serotypes, and they vary from being non-pathogenic to being highly pathogenic. It's a facultative anaerobe, as most gut flora are, and it behaves much like, the very pathogenic ones behave much like Shigella, in that they attach to the M cells, and they spread through the M cells, and they actually do enter the lymphatic system and are able to replicate inside macrophages, although most of their effect is actually on the gut itself. They remain close to the gut. This causes a generalized systemic illness as well as a gut reaction. And the people usually develop fever, intense nausea, gut pain with cramps, and a violent diarrhea. In many cases, this is self-limiting. It is quite a profound illness, however. But it does definitely result in deaths as well. And it can actually end up producing perforations of the gut wall. The reason that Salmonella is so important is because there are so many sources of the really pathogenic types. And they are very, very strongly associated, for instance, with birds. Poultry tolerate these pathogenic strains of Salmonella very, very well and pass the Salmonella out with feces. So we have a danger of picking up Salmonella, these pathogenic Salmonellas, from chicken flesh, which has been badly prepared after slaughtering, has been contaminated with gut contents, and also from egg production, because eggs are often soiled with bird feces. And the bacterium is actually able to penetrate and survives inside the albumin of the egg. The Salmonella is also associated with pets, by the way. That's pet reptiles and pet birds. You need to be very, very careful of dealing with them. In most cases, most of the serovars, most of the types of Salmonella only produce a mild and self-limiting illness. So most cases, people who get Salmonella, they get a mild fever. Nausea and vomiting may be very unpleasant and quite violent, diarrhea with cramping, but it's 12, 36 hours of intense acute illness and then a week or so of recovery. And to definitively say this is Salmonella and not something else, you really need to have to be tested. Usually stool samples are tested. They can also be tested by PCR to pick up the nucleic acids of the Salmonella and provide a typing. If it's really profound and vomiting and diarrhea is constant and people are losing a tremendous amount of fluid, then they are usually treated with rehydration therapy, but not with antibiotics. That most of these Salmonellas are a self-limiting illness, but it is always watched very, very carefully because there are those very serious types that can proceed to cause really profound illness. Here is one of those profound types, and that is referred to as typhoid fever. And it's a small group of the Salmonellas, and they're called serotype typhi or paratyphi. But this is only a human illness. This is not an illness which you would acquire from animals or from fecal contamination by birds or anything like that, like the more common, less serious salmonellas. Instead, this type is spread by human feces only. It used to be very, very common in the 19th century, well into the 20th century, when municipal sewage was not as efficient or non-existent. And it was much easier to have food or hands or whatever contaminated with human feces. This salmonella could be very, very easily spread. And it was a common illness and often a fatal one. It begins rather like salmonella, normal salmonella, excepting for one strange thing, and that is that there's no diarrhea. There may be fever, there may be nausea, but there's little diarrhea. And the bacteria enter, as I described before, through M cells and can then enter the lymphatics. And the bacteria release a very, very powerful toxin set. And the bacteria also may become, you may develop a septicemia from the presence of the bacteria. This is a gram-negative, and it produces a very potent endotoxin. And as cells die, as maybe the immune system attacks cells, etc., as cells die in circulation, they release these components of the outer membrane, and they cause septic shock. So the serious outcomes of the typhoid fever are, first of all, that if it should go into circulation as a septicemia, but second of all, they have a tendency high up in the intestine to cause ulceration, profound ulceration of the gut wall around those M cells where they settle and penetrate. And that leads to a perforation of the gut. And as soon as that happens, you get release of masses of bacteria, masses of different kinds of bacteria, not just Salmonella, but those normal bacteria of the gut. When they are released into the peritoneum, they cause peritonitis. And that in the old days, this was almost certainly a death sentence. And it was a frequent cause of mortality in many areas. It can also easily be spread. You'll realize if you have poor sanitation in a household, for example, somebody with a disease, with producing diarrhea, with this salmonella, for instance, could communicate that very easily to the rest of the household. People did recover, though, and this in itself was a problem, because about 3% of people who recover from typhoid fever actually continue to harbor the bacteria, especially in the gallbladder, and continually release it into their gut. They do not suffer from illness again, but they can release the bacteria, and they can continue to infect people, and they are a typhoid carrier. And the most famous, of course, of all of these typhoid carriers was here in New York, on Long Island and in New York, was Typhoid Mary. In the 19th century, she was a housekeeper who was a typhoid carrier, and she herself noticed that wherever she went, and she worked as a cook, whatever, people in that household would start to die of typhoid fever or acquire typhoid fever. And she fled from households several times, afraid that they were going to say that she was the cause. They eventually did catch up with her. And she, in those days, there was no treatment, of course, and she was actually quarantined away from people, so that she was unable to infect anybody. It's rather a sad story on her part. Wasn't her fault. Nowadays, this is treated with antibiotics. In the case of carrier, that may require lengthy treatment, but fecal samples would be continually tested to see whether they're still shedding. But this is really the most serious of all of the salmonellas that you have to deal with. So have a look here and realize both of these, typhoid fever and salmonellosis. Here, salmonellosis is referring to the ordinary food poisoning type salmonellas. Typhoid fever here is referring specifically to Salmonella typhi. And look at the incidence. Well, first of all, there's an absolute crash in typhoid fever associated with improved sanitation and also with the advent of antibiotic treatment. Salmonellosis, on the other hand, we have seen an increase. It's now pretty much stabilized. And this is reflective of modern food distribution. We have got food being brought in, for example, from farms and things from very distant farms, food, the cattle, chickens, whatever raised en masse can acquire the salmonella, and it then gets distributed throughout the country. So this here, it's pretty much stable. Foods inspection, for example, inspection of slaughterhouses, inspection of these kinds of facilities is what manages to maintain this stable background level of infection with salmonella. Okay, here's another of the really significant diarrheal diseases for human beings, and this is the disease of cholera. Cholera was one of the great plague diseases, and the plague diseases were those which swept through human populations and caused mass mortality, particularly during the from the Middle Ages on. They were recorded, passing through generally in waves, often resulting in absolutely staggering numbers of deaths. This disease, cholera, is caused by a bacterium, a gram-negative bacterium called Vibrio cholerae, which is a curved gram-negative rod. It's flagellated, usually has a single flagellum on the one end. Vibrio cholerae will grow in brackish water. That's water which is slightly salty, but not seawater. So it's very common in estuaries and river systems, those sorts of things. There are certain ecological situations which can lead to its beginning to increase in population, and that in itself can set off an epidemic if that water is consumed and enough bacteria are consumed. There is a set of toxins which cholera bacteria produce, which cause the cells of the gut wall to release masses and masses of fluid. The cells of the gut wall just begin weeping fluid in response to these toxins, and it causes a very distinctive type of stool. It's called a rice water stool. It's so dilute that it's just got a pearly gray kind of look to it. And a person can lose up to 20 liters of fluid a day. Now, we don't have nearly that much fluid in us. So you'll realize that a major effect of the disease is to cause a profound dehydration and very rapid dehydration. Not only that, but it causes the complete collapse of the electrolyte system of the body. This leads to organ failure and very rapidly leads to death. Cholera is one of those diseases where if people are left untreated, they can die within hours. It is an uncontrollable diarrhea, and it just ends up being pure body fluid being lost. And then they die of a profound dehydration. If the patient can be supported with IV treatment, with IV fluid replacements, very often it is self-limiting. They flush the cholera out very quickly, and the organism itself does not colonize the gut wall or anything like that. It's purely an effect of the toxins that it's releasing. Nonetheless, cholera is still an important illness. In old days, when, if you picture the sewage systems, if you can even call them that, where most people used an outhouse. Outhouses often communicated with a water table, and the water could be drawn from a water table that was infected with cholera. And this was one of the ways in which it was very easily spread. And you'll remember, for example, here's the organism. You'll remember the story I told you about John Snow, the first epidemiologist who traced a cholera epidemic in London to one single pump, water pump, and ended up, he stole the water pump handle to stop people using it and terminated an epidemic. So this is Vibrio cholerae. Here's countries worldwide still reporting cholera, and you'll see it's very, very widespread indeed. And it's very commonly associated with periods of disruption, for example, refugee situations, war situations, earthquakes, so anything where you have a large number of people and the sewage disposal system gets disrupted, they are at severe risk of a cholera outbreak. Cholera, the Vibrio cholerae bacterium itself is very, very widespread, very common member of normal water sources and things like that. Again, for natural disasters, remembering that it's not necessary to have sophisticated treatment. If people are treated efficiently with oral rehydration, that can be sufficient to support them through an episode of cholera. But if possible, IV rehydration is preferable. And there is a vaccine which can be given in emergency situations, be given to a large population to try and prevent. It's not a very good or very long-lasting vaccine, but it does provide some protection. Other than that, prevention of any fecal contamination of water sources especially is really important, but proper sanitation, water storage, and then personal hygiene, hand washing, that sort of thing, can limit an outbreak. Okay, so you'll have heard all through your microbiology career about E. coli. We talk about it frequently, and we do so because it's one of the common members of our own microflora. A gram-negative rod, a generic kind of facultative anaerobic rod. Under normal circumstances in our gut, it is, we could think of it as being a mutualistic relationship, because E. coli actually does provide us with some vitamins and various other things, and is part of our normal microflora, so it really does contribute to our health overall. So that's a normal mutualistic kind of relationship. We are giving it food, shelter, and warmth. It's giving us various products that are useful to us. However, the E. coli, there are many, many different strains of E. coli, and some of them have acquired virulence factors and become pathogenic, and some of them are truly serious pathogens. Not common, but nonetheless, there are 5 pathogenic strains that are recognized. The first are called the enteropathogenic E. coli. And these are just common causes of diarrheal disease. They have a very strange feature, that is that they attach to the cells of the gut wall, and they cause this change in structure. They cause these things called pedestals to form here. Here's a bacterial cell, and here's the cell it's attached to, and it's sitting up on this pedestal like that. That's where it gets this pathogenic name there. And it, again, is a self-limiting disease, but it can be very dangerous if one of these strains gets into a nursery where hygiene is poor. It can spread through a nursery, for example, very, very quickly and cause a very dangerous diarrhea in infants. In adults, it's self-limiting diarrhea and commonly picked up just from fecal contamination. This is one of the travelers' diarrheas where people buy food from a stall at the side of the road when people haven't washed their hands after they've been to the toilet, and they end up contaminating food with the bacterium, and people get this temporary diarrhea. The next kind is called Enterotoxigenic, and this is the real traveler's diarrhea. This is from the release of a toxin by the strain of E. coli. It's actually somewhat similar to the cholera toxin, and it's an enterotoxin. That is, it affects the gut directly. It's not the presence, it's not like the one that formed the pedestals that's actually attaching and causing damage to the gut wall. This one is strictly a toxin that causes the effects. And again, this is one of those where they survive gut passage quite well, and stomach passage quite well, end up in the gut, and they release this toxin and cause a temporary violent diarrhea, not usually associated with nausea, although it can be. Sorry. The next is enteroinvasive E. coli. This is much more dangerous. The enteroinvasive E. coli behave rather like Shigella. And they don't produce a toxin, but they cause a violent reaction of the mucosa of the gut, and can actually be ulcerative as well, but does not usually penetrate the gut. The main effects are actually a very, very powerful immune response, which causes a painful inflammation of the gut and of the gut wall. In some, it mimics the Shigella dysentery in that it can produce a bloody dysentery as well. And this is one of the reasons why in any of these cases, they will take a fecal sample and test very carefully clinically to distinguish, is this enteroinvasive E. coli, or is this Shigella, or what else could it be? The next is called enteroaggregative E. coli. This is limited to humans. Many of these others I should mention can be picked up from animals, from from fecal contamination, from slaughterhouses and things like that. But enteroaggregative is one that is not. It's strictly a human-to-human passage, and it's also it's a self-limiting disease. When you examine, you'll see that the cells pack together like this. They form these rafts of cells. That's why it's enteroaggregative E. coli. They do produce an enterotoxin that causes a watery diarrhea, but in healthy adults with a normal immune system, it's a self-limiting disease. In infants, it can establish itself for a much longer time. But this is not, by the way, not a common, not one. None of these are particularly common, but this is one of the rarer of them. This one, however, is one that is really of great significance. This is Enterohemorrhagic E. coli, EHEC, because it is extremely dangerous and potentially lethal. These bacteria not only behave very like Shigella, they produce Shiga-like toxins, and they also produce very profound effects if they are killed, for instance, by antibiotics. They release these Shiga toxins as cells die on lysis. There is one particular one which is really famous, and that is the E. coli 0157H7. This is very dangerous because it is harbored, the reservoir are in cattle. And these are usually acquired because of poor slaughterhouse practice, allowing meat to become contaminated with gut contents from cattle that hold this serotype 0157H7. And it causes a violent hemorrhagic colitis. It causes extensive damage to intestinal walls. It also releases the Shiga-like toxin into circulation, which causes a breakdown of red blood corpuscles, and it causes a collapse of the kidneys. That's hemolytic uremia syndrome. This is a very dangerous organism, and it is difficult to deal with because you cannot simply wipe it out with antibiotics, because that would cause it to release all of its Shiga toxin. It has to be very judiciously treated. It has a high mortality. It has a high mortality associated with it, I should say. And even people who recover may have sequelae after their infection. So this is the one to really be aware of, Enterohemorrhagic E. coli, 0157H7. This is the most dangerous of all of the E. coli, pathogenic E. colis that we have talked about. Okay, there are a couple of other that might be of interest. The first is this one, Helicobacter. Helicobacter is a bacterium which can actually live inside the stomach. It can live in the stomach wall. And it does so because it produces this enzyme called urease. And urease converts urea, which is the common byproduct of protein metabolism in the cells, converts urea to alkaline ammonia. So what it does is it regulates its environment. It regulates the pH of its environment in the stomach. It can be just a benign component of the stomach flora. But under certain circumstances, it begins to grow on the stomach wall, causing inflammation, immune reaction, and then causing ulceration. And this is the major cause of stomach ulcers. You may have heard stomach ulcers are from worrying or from stress or whatever. They're not. Stomach ulcers arise because of an infection with Helicobacter pylori. And it can be treated with antibiotics and also trying to regulate the pH of the stomach a bit and that sort of thing. And interestingly enough, it can be the presence of large populations of Helicobacter pylori can be picked up because you can pick up urea in the breath. Not that you can smell it, but it can be chemically detected in the breath. So this is Helicobacter. The exact disease process is not absolutely clear. Why in some cases it produces just a normal member of the microflora, and why it then passes into this pathogenic phase is not absolutely clear. But it is clear that it results as a result of inflammatory processes which seem to clear the protective mucus from the surface of the stomach and expose the stomach layers to digestion by the stomach acids. All right, so here is one. This one strongly associated with medical treatment and with hospital residence. So this Clostridium difficile. This is a disease-causing organism which is very strongly associated with nosocomial infection. It's a Clostridium, like all of the Clostridia. It's a gram-positive and very, very strict anaerobe. It is spread from patient to patient in the form of spores. In actual fact, It may form part of the normal gut microflora and simply not be able to establish a big population because it's outcompeted and continually exposed to oxygen. But it has become a very, very important agent of mortality in hospital settings, especially amongst the elderly. And it establishes a pathogenic condition where people have been vigorously treated with antibiotics and have lost their normal gut microflora. Once that happens, then Clostridium difficile can establish itself and begin to act as a pathogen. And it causes a life-threatening inflammation of the gut wall called colitis. It may cause ulceration, and it may cause penetration and then peritonitis. It has a particular way of growing, remembering that it is strict anaerobe. It needs to isolate itself from oxygen, and it does it by causing the formation of a pseudomembrane. You remember we talked about pseudomembrane in connection with diphtheria. This is a similar situation. It causes the gut wall to produce a thick, gluey kind of mucus, which packs in dead cells and bacterial cells in an anaerobic layer against the gut wall. And there's a very powerful immune response to this, which causes violent inflammation of the wall. Here's the normal large intestine. Here you can see, unseen to us, a layer of normal bacteria covering it. Here's a gut infected with Clostridium difficile, completely unable to behave normally, and this could result in the death of this patient. It is extremely difficult to deal with. This is a very difficult situation to deal with. And in fact, the simplest answer is to import into this gut a small amount of feces from somebody with a normal gut flora. And that very, very rapidly will reestablish a gut flora which will outcompete the big Clostridium difficile. Treating it with antibiotics is very, very difficult. It seldom responds. It's not available in this heavy growth of pseudomembrane. Just to mention a couple of others that I won't do in special detail, but I do want to mention this one, Listeria. Listeria is another foodborne disease-causing organism, and it actually is a very dangerous one if it escapes the gut. It can go into circulation as septicemia and cause meningitis, sepsis, all the rest of it. The reason that Listeria is important is it can continue to grow at cold temperatures, and that makes it very, very difficult, very dangerous organism. If food gets contaminated, it will continue to grow in the refrigerator. It's very dangerous in children. It has a very high mortality rate. And in actual fact, if the mother is infected, the fetus can be infected. It can move, because it moves so widely through the body tissues, it can actually move across the placenta and can actually cause abortion of a fetus. Another one, which I've left to last, even though surprisingly enough, it's the leading cause of foodborne illness in the United States, is Campylobacter. Campylobacter is very common in the intestines of poultry and of cattle. And it causes, again, a very violent nausea, diarrhea, but usually self-limiting. It may proceed in serious cases to an actual dysentery. So it is something that has to be watched really carefully, but it is normally a self-limiting disease. It has, for some reason or another, we don't know why, a high association of Guillain-Barré syndrome. That is the paralytic autoimmune response, which Campylobacter seems to spark. And the last one I mentioned is Bacillus cereus. Bacillus cereus is a very, very, very common environmental bacterium. It occurs in soil and water all over the place, but especially in association with damp grains, like cooked rice, kept cold, this sort of thing. It produces an exotoxin, which is very, very similar to the Staphylococcus exotoxin, and produces a similar result. And this is commonly associated with things like sushi, where rice has been cooked, contaminated, and kept for a time for the bacterium to grow. It releases its exotoxins, we eat it, and we get the results. Okay, so that's all that I need to say about gut bacteria and gut disease. Remember, along with the major respiratory infections of influenza, tuberculosis, all of those diarrheal diseases are major controlling mechanisms of human population size, or they have been, at least in our past, and in developing countries they still are. Let's move on talking about diseases of the urinary and reproductive systems, and we finish with that. Again, both the urinary and the reproductive systems, if you look at their structure, of course, they provide an entryway into the interior of the body. And in the case of the female reproductive tract, through the fallopian tubes, they actually provide an entry into the peritoneum itself, into the interior of the abdominal cavity itself. When we look at I've left the diagrams and everything of urinary and reproductive tracts up for you to revise your anatomy. But when we look at the normal urinary tract, it used to be said that urine was sterile, but in fact it appears that very often the bladder actually does have its own microflora. It is low in bacterial numbers, however. But normal urine is not, in fact, entirely sterile. Not only may there be bacteria and a microflora in the bladder, but there is definitely a microflora in the urethra. So urine passing through the urethra will pick up bacteria. The problems arise when we introduce bacteria from the outside to the urinary tract itself. And we're going to see that very frequently those infections are caused by E. coli and by Proteus. And both of these, E. coli and Proteus, are part of our normal gut microflora. And this is the common source of these urinary tract infections. The bacteria actually arise from the gut, and it's a fecal contamination in one way or another. In the vagina, there are a wide variety of bacteria which are perfectly normal microflora of the vagina. And many of these produce lactic acid. There are lactobacilli, which is specific to the vagina, but there are others which do produce lactic acid as well. Lactobacilli also produce peroxide, H2O2, and their growth is regulated by estrogen, and so it responds to the menstrual cycle. But the net effect is that the vagina has a healthy microflora which keeps pathogens out, and it is strongly exclusory. The normal microflora really works really well. There are all sorts of other bacteria, such as Streptococcus and all sorts of things. If you look carefully in the vagina, you may find this organism, Candida albicans. And Candida albicans is a single-celled fungus. It's a yeast, but it can be picked up in a perfectly normal sample. But if there is a disturbance of these other bacteria in the vagina, then Candida albicans can begin to overgrow. And when it overgrows, it causes an immune response. It causes an immune reaction of inflammation, itching, discharge, and that sort of thing. And this is a typical yeast infection, which many women will periodically report. And it is also associated with changes due to menstruation, and then later on with menopause as well. So it's the normal flora is responding to hormonal changes, and we may see a response in pathogens such as Candida albicans. Now, in the urinary tract, there's a couple of terms we need to get put aside. First of all, urethritis. Urethritis is an inflammation of the urethra, and while it's intensely painful, it's a useful symptom because it's very often the very first symptom we have that something is going on, something's wrong. Even though it's painful, at least we notice it, because we'll see that some of the other infections do not cause notable symptoms and may proceed without our being aware of them, particularly in the female genital tract. So urethritis is an inflammation of the urethra and usually produces pain on urination. Cystitis is an inflammation of the bladder. And cystitis, symptoms of cystitis, again, are pain, and a feeling of need to frequently urinate, even though you may only produce very small amounts of urine, and burning on urination. Now, that is cystitis. Ureteritis is a very serious condition. It's infection of the ureters. And infection of the ureters lead from the kidney to the bladder. They are very, very narrow space. There's a very narrow lumen for urine to pass down. And any inflammation of the ureters can lead to their blockage and pressure building up in the kidneys, which is extremely painful and very, very damaging. And that can also lead to pyelonephritis. That's an inflammation of the kidneys. Pyuria is the pain that you feel, and that pain is usually very high up on the back. It may in fact feel quite remote from the kidneys. It may feel as if it's up the back of the chest almost, but it can be an intense pain due to inflammation of the kidney. Urinary tract infections are very, very common, and they are common hospital-associated infections, healthcare-associated infections as well. Most urinary tract infections are due to these, Proteus mirabilis or E. coli, although they can be due to other things as well. It can be due to Pseudomonas and various other things as well. They are much more common. They are much more common in women than in men, and that is because of the shortness of the urethra in women compared to men. It's much easier for bacteria to make their way up the female urethra to the bladder and then perhaps on than it is for them but they definitely do occur in men. Comparable infections occur in men as well. So the symptom of urethritis can result from many different things. It's caused by an inflammation of the urethra, and this results in a burning sensation on urination. Men very often respond to several different infections with a urethritis where women don't. And so men very often notice urinary tract infection or sexually transmitted disease or whatever. In men, very often the very first symptom is a urethritis. As soon as somebody reports with urethritis, the medical practitioner has to make a distinction between urethritis caused by something like Neisseria gonorrhea, or this is gonococcal urethritis, where the person is suffering from gonorrhea, and non-gonococcal. Non-gonococcal or non-specific urethritis, they can be produced by many, many, many different organisms, some of which you'll recognize. First of all, E. coli proteus, yes. Chlamydia trachomatis, which we'll talk about in a little while, also a sexually transmitted disease. Then there are various others which can do the same thing. And we can even have a viral cause. Herpes, for example, a herpes infection will cause a urethritis as well. All of these would be non-specific urethritis, distinguishing them from this gonococcal urethritis. Cystitis is an infection of the inflammation of the bladder and commonly caused by E. coli or proteus infection. Again, much more common in women than in men. Polyuria is need for frequent urination, even if it produces very small amount of urine. Dysuria is painful urination. And pyuria is painful urination. Dysuria simply means difficulty in urinating, and often noted because there simply isn't any urine. You just feel like the inflammation makes you feel like you have to urinate, but there may not even be. But there are strict definitions because we do pick up bacteria in the urine normally. We usually establish a disease diagnosis when there are over 1,000 colony-forming units per milliliter in a single species. That's really a sign that there's an infection there that is monospecific, just one particular species. Now, these urinary tract infections are usually treated with something with really powerful, broad-spectrum antibiotics. And here is the reason, and that is that so many different bacteria can cause it. If you establish very quickly that it's non-gonococcal and it's a non-specific urethritis, it could be one of so many different bacteria that you treat usually with something like nitrofurantoin, which is a very powerful, broad-spectrum antibiotic, which will strike, as you'll see here, it'll strike at the gram-positives, as well as all of these gram-negatives and other things as well. Pyelonephritis is a very serious condition. It is not common result of urinary tract infections, but it is possible, and it's an infection and inflammation of the kidneys themselves. And usually by E. coli or proteus, which has proceeded from bladder all the way up to the kidneys, up the ureters. It's usually, because of the structure and the anatomy of the kidneys, it is usually results in a bacteremia, in actual circulation of bacteria as well. And that in itself can lead to sepsis and to septic shock. But the inflammation of the tissue of the kidney is extremely dangerous in itself because it can scar the tissue, scar the kidneys, and result in loss of function. And it's also suggested when we have very, very high counts of a single species in the urine. Like over 100,000 colony-forming units, we would get really, really worried that this infection could have spread to the kidneys from a bladder infection. It predisposes people to all sorts of subsequent kidney disease, and not least kidney stones and things like that. And the usual treatment is with something like cephalosporin. It's usually pretty easy to establish which bacterium it is doing it, usually E. coli or Proteus. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about some of the diseases of the reproductive system. First of all, it used to be referred to as STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Now, the more correct, we don't like to, a disease has some pejorative connotation, first of all. But second of all, we refer to these as sexually transmitted infection because some of them do not, in fact, cause disease. They're still an infection, but they may not, some of them may not result in disease, or under certain circumstances, then they may not result in disease. Especially in women, these sexually transmitted infections often produce no symptoms at all, but may still be very significant. There are many, many, many of these. There's more than 30 kinds. And they're very, very common, especially in young people, 15, 24-year-olds. Why? Because this is the peak of their sexual activity, and not only peak of sexual activity. This is when young people are likely to have many partners. The more partners you have, the more your risk of exposure. It should be noted that most of these, the transmission of most of these diseases could be prevented with condoms, with condom usage. And those of you who are sexually active, especially if you have more than one partner, or if your partner has more than one partner, you should really be observing safer sex procedures, not only for HIV that we've talked about before, but for prevention of the transmission of the diseases that we're going to be talking about here. Because this is no light matter. These diseases are serious. These infections can produce serious disease, and they can produce long-term sequelae that can be extremely serious. The first one that we're going to talk about is gonorrhea, and this is caused by the organism Neisseria gonorrhea that you've heard about before. And Neisseria gonorrhea is a Diplococcus, but unlike most cocci, it is gram-negative. It's one of the very few gram-negative cocci that you will hear about. It is very common, extremely common. And in fact, its incidence is increasing. There was a time when its incidence decreased, and that was during the AIDS epidemic, when people were observing the strict safer sex precautions. Since the pressure of that HIV epidemic has kind of lifted, and we don't hear so much about it anymore, people have become more and more lax about observing safer sex procedures. They're not using condoms as frequently. And as a result, the incidence of, especially of gonorrhea, and a couple of other diseases, beginning to increase. The bacterium attaches to the mucosa, and it invades spaces between the cells of the mucosa. It will insert itself between columnar cells, for example, of mucous membranes. It causes an intense inflammation, but it should be said that in women, that inflammation may not be noticed in particular, especially if it's high in the vagina. In men, it is very quickly noticed because in men, it invades the mucosa of the urethra. In women, it's colonizing usually mucosa of the vagina. But in men, it causes a urethritis. And that is gonococcal urethritis. And men, as soon as they have trouble urinating, they have pain on urination, you can bet that they very quickly begin to look to some way to deal with it. The organism, though, it must also be said, depending on your sex practices, it can also cause a pharyngeal, a very violent inflammation of the throat, violent sore throat, and that is usually as a result of oral sex and oral transmission. But it can also cause anal gonorrhea as well. And anal gonorrhea is somewhat serious because it may not, in fact, not be noticed that you have a focus of the infection. Rather, in similar way to the vaginal infection, the infection doesn't cause a direct pain the way urethritis does, and so it may sit there as a focus relatively unnoticed. The incidence, you can see here, the incidence is actually increasing again. This huge plummet in incidence here is due to two things. First of all, is due to antibiotic usage, which dealt with the infections, but all of this here, this massive decrease here, was probably due to safer sex practices, as well as adequate treatment. But we have continued, this upward slope here has actually continued since then. We're seeing an increase in the incidence again. Now, this term does not, the primary infection is not the only problem with gonorrhea. In women, the infection can proceed through the uterus via the cervix to the uterus and then into the fallopian tubes and cause a condition called pelvic inflammatory disease. The walls of the fallopian tube inflame, and it becomes difficult for eggs to passage through the fallopian tube to the uterus. And because of that, there is two dangers. First of all, of infertility. The egg simply doesn't ever become available for fertilization. But second of all, there is a danger that the egg will become fertilized. The egg is always fertilized in the fallopian tube, but there is a danger that if it's held back by inflammation, that it will settle onto the fallopian tube wall, and that causes what is called an ectopic pregnancy, an emergency situation. It can result in the bursting of the fallopian tube and peritonitis as well. The bacteria can also spread through a bacteremia, and they can end up causing endocarditis. They can even cause meningitis, and they can settle into joints and cause an arthritis as well. So we can have a disseminated gonorrhea as well. In women, as I've told you, the infection may be hidden. A woman may not notice that she has an infection, and this is dangerous to a fetus. An infant born to a mother with a gonorrhea infection may infect the eyes and causes a gonorrheal infection of the eyes, which is called ophthalmia neonatorum, which is very dangerous and can result in blindness. Very often, during pregnancy, a woman will be carefully questioned and examined for any likely gonorrhea infection, or she should be, and would be treated with antibiotics. But if in the case that a woman had gonorrhea infection anywhere close to her pregnancy, the child can be prophylactically treated with antibiotic eye ointments to prevent this condition. So gonorrhea in men causes a very characteristic pus discharge called GLEAT, G-L-E-E-T. And along with that, very, very painful urination. Okay, so here's another one that you have another STI you've probably heard of, and this is chlamydia trachomatis. Chlamydia trachomatis is a nasty organism. It's an intracellular gram-negative bacterium. It's a small bacterium, which in order to reproduce has to get inside cells. And when it does, it has a peculiar reproductive strategy. It produces these you see each of these. These are very small reproductive cells, which get released from the host cell and then go on to infect other cells. They're called elementary bodies. And basically, you can think of it almost like a spore. It's not really a spore, but it's like a very small chlamydial cell that then goes on to cause more infections. This is the commonest cause of non-specific urethritis. Chlamydia is very easily transmitted as a sexually transmitted infection, but can also be transmitted by hand infection as well. Even in men, it's often asymptomatic. And one of the main reasons it's so important is that it actually raises your risk of infection with other things as well, and also raises your risk of just a generalized infection with other organisms like E. coli or Proteus or whatever. It predisposes you to urinary tract and reproductive tract infections. Very commonly, it occurs together with another sexually transmitted infection. And in women, the effects are likely to be more serious. The first is inflammation of the fallopian tubes. That is called salpingitis, and then a resulting pelvic inflammatory disease. But in addition, there seems to be an association with increased risk of cervical cancer. The exact mechanism is not known. And in addition, this can be transmitted to an infant by vaginal birth. So this is one of the STIs that a pregnant woman is usually routinely inspected for. In other parts of the world, like in developing countries, chlamydia actually causes blindness, and it goes back, I told you about that earlier. This is the case where it is transmitted by flies from person to person. It also can cause a very dangerous disease called lymphogranuloma venereum. This is where the chlamydia get access to the lymph nodes. And by blocking the lymph nodes, by blocking the lymphatic capillaries, the lymphatic vessels, it can cause elephantiasis. Now, elephantiasis is usually caused by a worm, Wuchereria, but chlamydia can also produce an elephantiasis which looks very, very similar. It is treatable with antibiotics, though, azithromycin and doxycycline. These are freely available common antibiotics which can be used to treat it. So these pelvic inflammatory disease that I've already mentioned is of really great importance worldwide as a cause of morbidity in women. It can be extremely debilitating, painful, but also a major cause of infertility worldwide. And so this pelvic inflammatory disease as a result of these different infections that I've talked about is really a very, very important thing, especially in third world countries. Now, the other STI we really need to talk about is syphilis. Syphilis is caused by a spirochete called Treponema pallidum. It's gram-negative, very, very distinctive. It infects through breaks in the skin and initially forms an ulcer at the point of entry and then enters the bloodstream. And there are some strains of syphilis which cause another disease called yaws, which is actually, it remains as a skin disease and it's not sexually transmitted. The disease of syphilis is becoming more and more common. unfortunately, in the United States. This accompanies the decreasing use of safer sex methods, and syphilis is becoming extremely common amongst young sexually active people. Here is the organism itself. It's a spirochete. You remember, tightly wound spiral, which is wound around a flagellum, which runs down the middle of the cells here. And again, look at the incidence. This is before antibiotics were present in the population. After antibiotic use, then we begin to see an increase because of antibiotic resistant strains. Then a massive decrease associated with safer sex usage. Now we're beginning to see an increase again in the incidence. We need to return to these low levels and keep them there. So this is typical disease progression. Here is a man who's been infected with syphilis, and it produces this painless ulcer called a chancre at the site of infection that lasts about 3 weeks. This chancre weeps fluid, which is packed with the treponema, and is incredibly infectious. It will then heal up, but the man remains infectious. The infection has simply passed to its second stage, which is called secondary syphilis, which may last for many years. It sometimes produces an initial inflammatory reaction and then goes into a latent phase, but the disease is still present, and it is actually progressing, and the person is actually infectious at the time. They're not as infectious as they are here, but they are nonetheless still infectious. And the disease is progressing, and it may progress for many, many, many years before it enters what is called the tertiary phase. And this is, in the tertiary phase, there's very little that can be done to help people, because by now all of the damage has actually been done. Then the tertiary phase, which may appear up to 20, 30 years later after initial infection, the immune system begins to attack cells which have been infected by the treponema, but it also begins to attack other cells as well. It sets up an autoimmune response. And this can have wide-ranging effects. These here are called gummas, G-U-M-M-A. And these are breakouts from lymph nodes, which are being attacked, which are effectively decaying. But it can also cause cardiovascular effects. And especially it is a major predisposing condition for aortic aneurysm, for a ballooning of the aneurysm and bursting. But probably its most dreaded effects are those on the nervous system. It causes distinctive effects on the central nervous system and causes dementia as well. A woman who is infected can pass the disease on to children, and that there are distinct syndromes which are associated with intrauterine infection with syphilis, especially neurological, serious neurological effects. Syphilis is still relatively easily treated with penicillin-based antibiotics. There are resistant strains which are arising, however, but nonetheless, syphilis remains highly treatable. Here it is under the microscope. This is dark field microscopy. We shine the light from the side, not through the stage. Light bounces off the spirochetes and makes them very visible. But you can also stain them with an antibiotic, with antibody to the treponema, and the antibody is attached to a fluorescent dye and you can see them under fluorescence microscopy. Also, there are a whole lot of different serological tests. You can have blood tests for the presence of syphilis. Because it has such a long hidden latent phase, these tests have, very sensitive tests have been developed to detect signs of it in the blood. There is another disease which is often mistaken for syphilis, for primary syphilis, and this is this disease called chancroid. It also causes a chancre, but this is a painful ulcer. Not painless. In syphilis, it is painless. It is usually very quickly treated because of the pain associated with it. It's caused by this organism. It's a Haemophilus ducreyi. The last one I'll mention, I think, oh no, it's not, I'll go one more, is candidiasis, infections with Candida. I've already talked about. These infections of the reproductive tract are most common in women. And that is because Candida is a normal member of the vaginal microflora, which blooms every now and again. And that's these overgrowths due to hormones, as I've mentioned, but also can be caused if you're taking antibiotics for an entirely different reason. Maybe you've got bacterial infection of the throat that you're taking antibiotics for. Those antibiotics will actually affect the composition of the microflora in your gut and in your reproductive tract, and can predispose to something like this yeast infection. It causes a vaginitis, which is an irritating inflammation, itchy very often, and with a characteristic discharge, which often has a characteristic smell to it. People realize they have a yeast infection. Nowadays, often treated with over-the-counter medications, which are easy to get, and that responds very well to things like clotrimazole, fluconazole. You'll remember these if you think back to our skin diseases caused by fungi. These are the same compounds. The last one to mention is this one. It's called trichomoniasis. It's caused by actually a protozoan, protist, called Trichomonas vaginalis. Here it is here. You've got a little flagella there. Here's the cell here. It's got flagella, and it's got a membrane down the side here. A very active swimmer. And Trichomonas is also a normal component of vaginal microflora, but this one responds to changes in pH of the vagina. The vagina is normally acid, from lactic acid, from the lactic acid bacilli that grow there. And it forms, when it does overgrow, Trichomonas or trick causes a frothy, green, tinged, foul odor, the discharge, foul-smelling discharge. Easily identified under the microscope, but can also be picked up with a DNA probe. And it is treated with metronidazole. And metronidazole is commonly used for these flagellate infections. Elsewhere as well, metronidazole is used when we have gut infections with different flagellates like Giardia. And I think that is it. Okay, I've enjoyed teaching you. I'm sorry we've had to rush through some of this stuff, but I hope that you've learned a lot, and I'm sure that you're all going to do well. Remember that your exam is on Friday, not on Wednesday. We've changed the date to Friday, so I'll see you then.